beanie. And I went to school. I tucked my brownie beanie in my pocket. After school, we had brownies, and my troop leader said, "Nanda, you have to wear your brownie beanie. Why don't you have your brownie beanie? Every girl has to have their uniform on." And I pull out my brownie beanie, and she tries to work with it and tries to get it in my hair, tries to make it fit in my hair. And again, it looked silly and it was embarrassing. And I'm the only person that has this little afro. And you know, and after a couple of times of going to brownies, to me, it just wasn't that important anymore, because I realized, even as a little girl, that that brownie beanie was not meant for me to wear. It was never designed for me to wear. And so as I got older, looking at situations that, when we talk about racist policies, we talk about policies that were never put in place with the idea that it was to help African Americans, or that African Americans were even taken into account for some of those policies. Just like that brownie beanie was not created or designed for me as a little brown girl, there are policies that were not created or thought about in their designing or creation for brown people. And that's what we talk about when we talk about racist policies. It's not just, you know, a racist standing on the corner screaming your, you know, a slur, a racial slur. It's these little things that are put in place that put people of color at a disadvantage. And those are the racist policies that an anti-racist seeks to find, first of all, seeks to find and identify, and then seeks to make it equitable and either reform it, change it, or get rid of it. So I hope that that is what you were wanting me to share.
That's the one. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It reminded me of when I was a Boy Scout. I joined Boy Scouts when I was 11 years old. And for those of you who can't see me, I'm white. And I got into Boy Scouts. I was all excited, and then was in there for probably a month or two. And then one day my dad says, "Well, you can't be in this Boy Scout troop anymore, and we're going to find a new Boy Scout troop for you." I loved Boy Scouts. I just had a blast with it. But, and it was years before I realized what had happened, but they pulled me out of that troop because my patrol leader was black. And it wasn't a problem with me. I mean, this guy was my hero, but it was with my parents. And that's the culture that so many of us, I think of my generation, grew up in. And if you had asked them, they probably would have said, "Oh, no, that's not a problem, but we just don't want you being exposed to that." And I laugh at it now, but it's the kind of culture that too many people grow up in. I think even now I hear stories like that. I know in New Mexico, well, I'll tell you a story. One time I was working out on the Navajo reservation. I did a lot of work out there through the years. And we were driving into Albuquerque to get some equipment. And I was in the back of the van. And one of our crew was driving. He was black. Every other person in the van except for him and me was Navajo. And I had kind of dozed off. And all of a sudden I feel us pulling onto the shoulder. And I go, "What's going on?" And the driver, who was Navajo, said, "Well, we're being pulled over for DWI." I go, "DWI? None of us are drinking." He says, "No, driving while Indian." And 3 cop cars pulled us over just to see why an Indian was driving a van. And this was not that long ago. And, you know, that's the kind of thing that goes on all the time. If it had been me driving, I promise you, we would not have been pulled over.
Hey, that's an interesting story. How y'all doing? This is Brother Daryl Cosmon.
Hey, Daryl.
Hey, how you doing, Gordon? I joined your group. You remember me from last week.
I do.
I joined your group. And I like to say that this was a wonderful inspiration. Joining this meeting, I've actually started to do a meeting based on this book with a group of white families that I know that that are associated with the school that my kids go to, and there's a meeting we're going to be doing in a couple of weeks once everybody get a chance to order their books and get into reading it, because I feel like doing Zoom meetings based on how to be an anti-racist is my way of helping to fight racism. So, hey, how you doing, Jim? Well, real quick, I do have to leave in about 6 minutes because I'm working from home and I have a meeting at 2:30 here. I do want to say I want to bounce off what Nanda was saying about policies that put other races at a disadvantage. Yes, that does exist for anybody that does not believe that it exists, and you can also take a look at this in history, especially when the slaves were freed. When the slaves were freed back in 1865, it put a huge dent in cotton corporations in the South. And that's just one of many corporations. And so as a strategy to get Black folks back into slavery, they created laws. One of the laws, which was one of the biggest ones, was vagrancy. So which means that if you did not have a job, that you will be put back, you will get put into prison, and a lot of these prisons were labor prisons that caused Black people to go back into the cotton fields or to build railroads and so on and so forth. Well, also coal mines was a big thing too. But it didn't stop there. You know, there's been lots of laws that have been created throughout time, even to this day, that does not consider people of color. Well, I don't want to say people of color. I'm sorry, all people are colorful, but for Black people.
I had never thought about that with the cotton industry, and I didn't know about the coal. But thank you, and I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, no problem.
Just for a little while. It's good to have you with us.
If you wanna learn more in depth about the vagrancy laws and other laws that put Black people at a disadvantage, there's this book out. I don't remember the author, but there's this book called Neo-Slavery or Slavery by Another Name, something like that. I'll go find the book once I put my phone on mute, and I'll put the title of the book and the author in the comments just before I get out. But that's another book that's very interesting. But it does talk about, it's a book that's full of laws that was created to put Black folks at a disadvantage, especially back into slavery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we see some of that going on today with the for-profit prisons.
Yes,
you look at the demographics of the prison population here in the United States, and somewhere I have the figures. I think they're actually in the book, and I have them here on one of these pieces of paper. But it's very inequitable. Far more people of color in prison for very minor crimes than there are whites, and they serve longer sentences than whites typically do. There's a figure in the book I saw that a Black person convicted of a minor nonviolent crime can serve the same amount of time that a white person convicted of a violent crime would serve. And I don't even know what to say about that. It's so inequitable.
Yeah, that what you just said, a lot of that happened in the 90s when Clinton got in office.
Yeah.
And that's something that's well known. The prison population has spiked because of laws that the Clintons had made, Bill Clinton made when he was in there.
So one of the other things that I will bring up too in the state of Missouri, in talking about racist policies, in Missouri right now, if you are a Black person, you are 95 times more likely to be pulled over by a police officer than a white person. Now, when they started collecting this information, the reason they had to collect this information is because a person sued the state of Missouri. This has been about 4 years ago. The first year they did it, they were 75 times. Black people are 75 times more likely. The second year, 85 times. The third year, 91 times. This information just came out in May. Black people are 95 times more likely just to get pulled over than a non-person of color. And if you think about that, that right there puts them into a mix of having something possibly happen that needn't happen. You know what I'm saying? So it actually puts them at risk for things. So if you just in wrapping your head around that is within itself. And this is something that we've known for 4 years, for the last 4 years. Our Attorney General is collecting this information. It's not any, other group. This is actually information collected by our Attorney General, given to them by police officers across the state of Missouri. And so these are policies that need to be changed. They need to be changed. Education, every option that we have, they need to be changed.
Yeah, that's right. And getting the word out and making this information public may go a ways towards helping that happen. I'm reading some other figures here as we are, we're talking, that figures like this. The average, white people live an average of 3.5 years longer than Black people due to inequalities in healthcare and environmental factors. This I found interesting, is 4,000 areas have water supply systems with higher lead contamination than does Flint, Michigan, even. And those are almost 100% poor and non-white areas. I look at where I'm from in New Mexico, we have communities called colonias, which are unincorporated communities, usually way out in the middle of the desert, where there's no electricity, no running water, no sewer system. And the arguments, when they do try to develop the place where they live, they get arguments that, no, you can't incorporate because you don't pay enough taxes. Or, one of the arguments that was in the news about 8 years ago was that people who live in colonias are lazy, which just kind of was beyond my comprehension, because you can't live in one of those places and be lazy. It's just not even possible. Survival takes everything you got. But these are the stories that are told when anytime there's any kind of an attempt to solve some of the problems like this. And the excuse they use is there's not enough of a tax base, which, I don't know how we even begin to change that, except get the word out. So, anybody else?
I know where we're at in Kansas City. I live just north of the river, and we live in the school district is North Kansas City School District, and so we're divided up into, and this is ELISA, by the way, and we're divided up into 4 different schools. And so Kansas City did this great thing of dividing up the community, and well, let's say about 20 years ago, they were trying to reintegrate students and trying to make it more diverse in different schools. And in the process of that, they made it even worse for a lot of young kids, because they were pulling kids from their own neighborhoods, putting them over here. That was an hour away. And so they couldn't even do the extracurriculars. So trying to integrate the schools in that way wasn't working. So then we live north of the river because of accreditation purposes. And here with our 4 schools, I noticed that where we particularly live in our neighborhood, people even today still have that syndrome of people from the inner city are moving up, they're doing better for themselves, they're moving north of the river, better school systems, more accreditation. And then you've got the thing called white flight, where the people that don't want to live in the same neighborhood as people that are coming from the inner city, so they want to move farther north, up into Kearney and the more rural areas. So it's educating people to embrace change and not to quite run from it. I I know with our school, my daughter, the high school, one of the things that in my area, I always make a big stance. I'm dating a man that's a realtor, and he says a lot of people don't want to live where I live in my neighborhood, even though it's a nice neighborhood, because my school happens to have an area where supports some low-income housing developments, and unfortunately, there's some huge disparity in socioeconomic divisions between people of color, and so therefore, our high school is least desirable. I noticed that with our sports and our money this year. My son plays basketball, and they were saying it's a shame the way they divided it up, because see, now we're getting less monies because of the dividing lines of the schools when they reorganized it. So there's some disparity in even the way the system has made the dividing lines, even in the reorganization in the last 5 years. And I don't know that it was consciously done that way, but it affects the students that are right here that need it the most. So.
This is Jim. I live in Pittsburgh, Kansas, predominantly white neighborhood, although there are people of color in the neighborhood, various color. Anyway, that's not the issue. Alicia, thank you for your story. It is unfortunate that the school system chose to do that. There may be more to that. I mean, I'm kind of a suspicious character. I understand that gerrymandering is handled much the same way, in that a piece of a neighborhood that will not support a particular candidate, when that candidate has anything to do with drawing the maps that determine the voting, will draw the map according to the constituency that will support him or her. So I'd want to check the Board of Education and see what was behind that particular determination, particularly if it put one school at a socioeconomic disadvantage, and that is that school was a particularly weighted in terms of a racial dynamic. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you everybody for sharing. This reminds me of a policy that is also racist, is how we even fund education in a lot of our country. I think it may be everywhere, but I know everywhere I've lived, education is funded based on property taxes. And of course, in underdeveloped communities, property taxes are lower, which means you cannot have good quality schools based on that model. To me, it would make sense to have our schools funded equally across the board.
We run into that here in Carthage, where I work a lot, because it is a communication issue for many of our primarily Spanish-speaking households or singularly Spanish-speaking households. And a lot of that money is determined based on census figures. And right now, our census figures are showing really low because there is a language barrier and there is a communication issue in terms of our Spanish-speaking households not understanding that this is not information that's going to go to immigration, that it is for a separate purpose. And so we've experienced that. I have a lot of agencies contacting me wanting to know how to reach our Spanish-speaking homes. And so we're able to give them a little bit of guidance as far as that goes. But additionally, it's been weird here. And it's given me a fantastic opportunity to be regularly and daily anti-racist here recently, because since the COVID breakout here in Carthage was specifically originally, not specifically, but I should say primarily originally in work clusters, there was a wonderful explosion of blame that came along with that, of people wanting to call it whatever they wanted to call it, but basically a brown disease, blaming it on the brown people in town. And that gave me a fantastic opportunity to confront that on an almost daily basis for the last few weeks. And along with my Jasper County Health Department, Carthage Police Department, and Carthage Fire Department, we've had a nice time fighting back against that particular, and getting a chance to be, as I said, anti-racist on a daily with that information.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that it was, that's how they were describing it there.
Well, you wouldn't have read it in a news. You wouldn't have read it in a newspaper. Yeah. But being that I have a very public job and am on social media a lot, you know, there's that anonymity of social media where no one can see you when you're an a-hole. Right. Yeah. So, yeah, that's true. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of private messages on Facebook and things like that to the chamber page, and so it's been a nice opportunity to fight back a little. Yeah. Yeah.
I appreciate hearing that, because it just infuriates me when I hear that the COVID is referred to as the China disease or the Kung Fu disease or anything of that nature, because xenophobia is very, very real. And it makes me, when I go down to the river market, I'm going to the China shops and I'm shopping and supporting their businesses, because these people should not be targeted just because we have one speaker who wants to sit there and place blame on them. I mean, I work for the Department of Health of the state of Missouri. It's no one's fault. It's a disease. Yeah. Yeah. So,
it's a virus. Yeah, it happens.
Yes, and I always try. This is Nanda again. I always try to explain to people sometimes, because I live in McDonald County, and we actually had, and I'm just right over the line to Newton County, but we had some press put out where it literally called out the community that these clusters were found in. And it was so upsetting to me, primarily because people need to take into account that they are the ones doing this work of feeding us right now. Yeah. I mean, like, we have put them at risk. Anyone who is eating right now and happens to eat the products that some of these places make, we put them in jeopardy of their lives every single day. So yes, there might be clusters in these groups, but who puts them at jeopardy? We do. And so therefore we have to take on some of that responsibility of making sure to care for them. And when I'm saying care, I mean health care, but also care as in human care, giving them support. So I get a little bit impassioned about that. Sorry.
Yes, but you know, that's something we don't think about. You know, it's I was a school teacher too, and it was amazing to me how many of my kids, you know, never even, and some of their parents never thought about where food actually comes from and how it gets to our table, and all the different people that are involved in that process and how important they all are. Without any link in that chain, there's no, you know, we wouldn't have food to eat. So, unless there's any other questions or comments, I think we can move into chapter 2. We ready?
Well, I mean, if I could just be that guy.
Yeah, be that guy.
All right. Well, something that came to mind in this conversation was something they call redlining, which is basically when you're refused a loan or even insurance, just because you might be a risk. We have to understand that, like, a lot of these realtors are kind of catering to the neighborhoods that are established. And so they might turn someone down just because they're Black. It doesn't say that in this definition here, but that happens. It definitely happened a lot in the early 80s and I'm sure it still happens in certain parts, maybe right here in Joplin. And, you know, like if you are a Black family and you want your kids to go to a good school, like you can't get a house there, so you're stuck renting if you really want to try, and that's super important to a lot of these families. So like, but then they have no control of the education system like you were talking about, like, because they're not property owners, they're not landowners.
Yeah, exactly. And people shouldn't have to move for their kids to go to a good school. I mean, wherever they are, it should be a good school. And there's no reason why in our culture, in our country, we can't make that happen, except for policies and prejudice.
Yeah. Yes, that still happens right now. I have a good friend who, when they moved to town, were looking at a house, and a realtor who is working right now as a realtor in Joplin said, "Let me take and show you the part of town where no Black people are living. You guys look like you probably want to be around a place where no Black people are living." Like, that was the statement that was made to them.
Wow.
And it's so sad to me. When my parents moved back from California when I was a little girl in 1971, 1972, no one would sell us a house besides a house over in Easttown. And my father was very adamant that he wanted to live over on another side of town. And I will just bring this up because Neely talking about doing anti-racist work. Neely's grandfather was the only person who would sell my father a house at that time, and sold us a house over on the other side of town. And to think that happened in 1970, and you still have people that are redlining right now, making sure that people stay in certain areas, is just it's exasperating.
Yeah, it does happen today, and I can give you a story that is going on right now in our family. My daughter and her partner are looking for a house. Her partner has lived in the United States since she was, I believe, 3 years old. She was born in Mexico. She's 30 some odd years old now, and graduated school. She's a hard worker, has a career, never been in trouble or anything. And they went to apply for a mortgage, and my daughter's income is figured into what they can afford, but not her income. But all of her debts are figured in to what they can afford when they're, pre-qualifying. And it's because, well, she's not a legal citizen of the United States. But yet they'll figure in her debt. So how is that right?
Another system that is structured around racism, the monetary system.
Yeah, very much so. Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, let's go to chapter 2. Wow. A week and a half to get through chapter 1. This is going to be a good book, I can tell. Chapter 2 gives us some more definitions right at the beginning. And the first one is an assimilationist. And that is one who is expressing the racist idea that a racial group culturally or behaviorally is inferior and is supporting cultural or behavioral enrichment programs to develop that racial group. Just the other night, my wife and I sat and watched a movie that I used to use to teach, called "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee." I don't know if anybody has ever seen that. If you have not, I strongly urge you to watch it. But it tells the story of, oh gosh, now that I'm telling the story, his name went right out of my head. But one of the stories it tells is also a senator in Washington, D.C. named Dawes, who was responsible for basically ripping off a lot of Native Americans of their lands that were guaranteed to them by treaties in the late 1800s. And he had this idea that Native Americans should be assimilated, like they should just blend in until eventually they no longer exist. And that's what this definition is talking about right here. Assimilation is, it's denying a culture, it's denying a people, it's denying value of humanity. And it is prevalent even today. So any comments about that?
Yeah, that was the kill the savage, save the man.
Yep, exactly. In fact, I think they even used that exact line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty gross.
It was, yeah.
It was in that case.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we find some of this also within the Black culture of there being rules against Black women wearing their hair naturally. You know, there's just a lot of times, I know when I used to wear braids in my hair, or even sometimes my hair the way that it is now, I wear my hair in a natural afro, people would think, oh, you're dirty, you got dirty hair, or you're this or you're that. That's another way when they would put laws in place like that, that requires Black people to assimilate into something that they're not. Mm-hmm. Straighten your hair or wear it in a similar style as a white person.
Yeah.
And so you find those in a lot of different aspects too.
I remember seeing this a couple times last year with young people, with teenagers who, one of the children was a wrestler, and I can't remember what the other child did, perhaps a soccer player, but both of them were forced to cut their dreadlocks before they were allowed to compete at a state level, I think. And locally they had been okay, but once they got to a state level, it was, well, you've got to do it right now if you want to compete. And so I think they both ultimately made the choice to do that, and it was mortifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was in New Mexico, I got called to the hospital in Grants, which is west of Albuquerque, about an hour and a half. A Native American family had been involved in just a terrible car accident, and their son, who was 11 years old, and they were traditionals, and that means they lived their culture. They had shaved his head when they brought him in. Not because he had a head injury, but they were afraid he had lice, which he didn't, but they shaved his head. So, but and he was unconscious when they brought him in from blood loss. But when he regained consciousness, they called me into his room because this child, cutting your hair in that culture means that you have lost a loved one. So here this poor 11-year-old kid comes out of a coma, and the first thing he realizes is his hair is cut, and he is, under the impression that his family has been killed. And, I don't think the doctors or whoever cut his hair really was thinking about that, but that's the kind of things we do because of ignorance. Anybody else? All right, well, our next definition then is segregationist. One who is expressing the racist idea that a permanently inferior racial group can never be developed and is supporting policy that segregates away that racial group. I think there's still a lot of that goes on today. I see people and hear people who say, well, we should just live apart. There was somebody on the news the other night, and I forget who it was, who said he believed that segregation was the only answer to our problems. It's a good thing he was on the TV because I felt like smacking him. But anybody else? Any comments?
We have these problems in our society, and most of what people can see is that there's this problem. They don't see any way around it. They think that's just the way we are, and that's just the way.
Yeah.
And they make no room for what can be or what should be. And I don't know. I think that's the main issue there.
Yeah. You know, I've been reading a book on evolution, and one of the things it talks about is any species of creature, and particularly human being, Homo sapiens, or hominids, I should say, the ones that evolved were the ones that could change their thinking about things. The ones that went extinct, all the different branches of hominids, were the ones that could not change their thinking. And, you know, sometimes I wonder about Homo sapiens, because we are slow, and especially white ones, to change our thinking. And many of us are, well, not of us on this call probably, but many of them are afraid to change or unwilling to change their thinking. And that's evolution. We have to.
Right, we do. And I think all of this is probably bringing up for us areas that have got to be addressed.
Yes.
You know, for instance, the training of doctors working there in grants or whatever, where they're working in another culture, the cultural training needs to be in place. Yeah. And hopefully with this bringing forth some of it, I mean, it's like the light is being shown on things that have been hidden in the darkness, you know. And so hopefully there's a chance for some correction as this continues, just as we point out the things that need to change, such as this poor child's hair being cut because of a lack of cultural awareness.
Yeah.
And that's happening just in so many places, in so many ways right now. We just see it. It's like it's just being shouted from the rooftops. Things have to change.
Right.
I will say one thing when you were discussing the segregationists is that there are people who do believe that it is easier for them to live separate from communities. It's easier for them as a race to live separate from communities, that don't believe it is because the other race is inferior, but it's almost a protectionist type of thing to protect themselves. And it's I see this often in communities, especially South America and some of the Caribbean communities and African American communities. They do prefer. There are times that and there are spaces even where people prefer to be able to voice themselves and talk about certain things without having people of other races, and I'll be honest with you, primarily white races, who have put them at risk so very often. And so I think there's a distinction there. A segregationist believes they have to live separately because another race is inferior. There are spaces created many times for Black people to have, or people of color to have space within their own race, and not having white people in that space. But that's not done because they think white people are inferior. It's done in order for sometimes to just to breach subjects that they or feel protected within a community, if that makes sense. I just wanted to point that out.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of it from that angle, but yes, you are correct. Yeah. Okay. All right. The next definition is anti-racist. One who is expressing the idea that racial groups are equals and none needs developing, and is supporting policy that reduces racial inequality, which is what we are exploring here, what we are striving to do. You know, who was it that brought up the laws that created the for-profit prisons and all of that? Was that Daryl, or who was that? Whoever it was earlier.
Yeah, that was Daryl.
Yeah, okay. I came on some figures here. The war, and it talks about this in the book. The war on drugs, or in reality was a war on Blacks, began on June 24th, 1982. And there's a quote from Ronald Reagan that says, "We must put drug abuse on the run through stronger law enforcement," which became persecution of blacks. It was from 1980 to 2000 that prison population swelled, quadrupled in the United States. We have the highest per capita rate of incarceration in the entire world across the board, and certainly the highest rate per capita of people of color. And studies show that people who consume drugs, it's even across the board as well. So why would there be such a higher ratio of people of color in prison when just as many whites consume drugs as people of color? Here's another figure. 56% of all nonviolent prisoners are Black and Latinx, which is twice the percentage of adult population in the United States. And John, this I found really interesting, and I did look it up, and not because I doubted the author of Ibram Kendi, but because I was curious. And sometimes people say, well, how do you know that's true? So I always try to check this stuff. But John Ehrlichman did admit years later that they knew they were lying about this situation when they passed these laws. So, and one of the things that I heard on a newscast just the other night with one of the protests where somebody was shouting, some white supremacist was shouting out, well, what about black on black crime? You know, and even then I thought, well, come on, that's number one, not what we're talking about here. And number two, it's not as big an issue as this is. It's just an attempt to divert the conversation. I mean, you could say, well, what about white on white crime? You know, that's just an attempt to dilute what we're talking about.
Right, and there's so many more white people that there's definitely more white on white crime.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Well, and I also think when you're talking in an education piece, why would I educate a bunch of white people about black on black crime? Why would I mean, because the audience is teaching me how to be an anti-racist. Mm-hmm. How is that helping me show up in a better way to be an anti-racist?
Yeah. Yeah. And then in this chapter too, he talks about how the civil rights laws were actually rolled back in the 1980s. Affirmative action regulations were countermanded. Funding for state and local governments for contracts with minorities were canceled. Federal welfare programs were changed, all of which was designed to force people of color into poverty. So, Nanda, you said something earlier about economic policy and how it's racist many times. And do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, you know, I think it's very important for us to just even our monetary system. If you look at every single one of our bills, the people listed and their faces on those bills, we know that our monetary system was never created with Black people in mind. There's not a single person that was created on the face of any of our bills that was created with Black people in mind. We look at our stock market. Our stock market, you know, it soars at times that people of color are hurting the most. I find it very interesting right now that our stock market is shooting up so high when right now we know that Black and brown people are dying and at a larger number than anyone else in the United States with COVID-19. But, you know, if it was primarily just, if it was something like this happening to just white people, we would see a decline in these numbers. You know, when you have a monetary system that is based on how well the most prominent population is, that system is set up as a racist system. And until we look at those inequities, until we understand that to create wealth, we can't just create wealth for one segment of our population. And unfortunately, our monetary system then trickles down. People have brought up about, education. It trickles down into so many different things. But yeah, when we're talking about this monetary system, people have to recognize it for what it actually is. It was never created with Black people in mind, and continues to be propped up with the idea of the more more prominent, oftentimes white citizens. I find it interesting. I was talking about people feeding people. We look at right now, everyone's supposed to go back to work. Everyone's supposed to go back to work and to help our economy right now. But if you truly think about it, the people who most people that will go back to work, not, that in order to participate in the economy, if you're going back to work out doing the same job you had before, more often than not, it's going to be the poor people and it's going to be minorities. We have a system that is, people are working now from home. They're working in businesses that are kind of shut down, but those people are going to be people that are primarily white, unfortunately. So to get back to work and bring up our economy, you're doing it on the backs of Black and brown people. That's just, there's no other way to look at it. Primarily, it will be done on the backs of Black and brown people who are the most vulnerable in these situations that result from COVID too. So again, we have this whole system that is created not to uphold Black and brown bodies.
Yeah, and they are the most, it's most likely that they would be the ones to not have resources, insurance, whatever, to handle it if they did get sick.
Very true.
Yeah. Okay. Wow, it's 3 o'clock already. I'm just gonna kind of wrap it up today with this, that because this is something that is common in our culture. We are trained in the Western world to see deficiencies in people. I know when I was a teacher now, I taught at a school that was different than a lot of other schools, but when we get students from other schools, one of the things I noticed every single time was that they knew everything that was wrong with themselves, because they'd been told it over and over and over again. And so we're trained in our culture to look at the deficiencies and to focus on those rather than to see the gifts. And we are also trained largely as whites to look at deficiencies, we are told, of other races. That idea that we are the supreme race, or the most advanced race, or whatever. And it's very much a cultural thing. I would read the IEPs of my students. I never read them until they'd been in the school for about a month, because I wanted to get to know the kid first. But I'd eventually read them and usually toss most of them out from the other schools because they were worthless. But some of the comments just would totally blow my mind. It's like, well, this person comes from a family from Mexico, so they can never excel. Or this person, obviously the culture I dealt with was more Hispanic than Black, but I think a lot of, what you hear and see with regards to race is probably going to be similar. It would break my heart sometimes, the things that well-meaning people would say and focus on. Anybody have any comments? Are we on? Hello?
Yeah, we're on.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And I think what you brought up is really, really good. And imagine what people are focusing on being something that you are unable to change.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, just like sit in that for a second. So, you know, people can focus on a lot of different traits or attributes about other people. But if the trait that they are focusing on and you know, scoring you at a lower level, or do every single thing they're doing within to you is a trait, or is something that you can't change. You can't change the color of your skin. You can't change the type of hair you have.
Mm-hmm.
You can't these are things you cannot change. And to have that be something that you are judged upon,
Yeah.
you know, and that there is racism.
It is. Yes.
Linda, I sure appreciate your insight on that issue. And Gordon, I know it sounded like you were closing out this segment for this week. And what I'd like to suggest, you know, we can sit and we can talk about all the things that are wrong with the system and point out various things. Nanda just brought to our attention that there's only one, well, there's one place that we can change things, and that is with us.
Yeah.
And I think as per the discussion earlier, it's only when we examine our own thinking, our own beliefs, that we can impact what's going on around us. So perhaps this week's homework, if you will, would be for us to look into our own belief systems, examine how we personally, be it black or white, have contributed in some way or been affected by racism in America. Do I get an amen on that one?
You get an amen. And actually, I'm pulling out there's a workbook with this.
Oh.
And one of the things it says, one of the assignments is, let me find it here. Funny that you should mention that. Hang on, I gotta find it here. I was just looking at it last night. It was describe your bear with me here. I'm looking.
While Gordon's looking, maybe I can take some of the heat off of him.
Thank you.
I just got the package that I believe my book is in, but while I've been waiting for that, I've been listening to an audio version of White Fragility.
Mm-hmm.
Robin DiAngelo, I believe is her name. And she lays out in that book how we have benefited from this racism thing to the extent of the various, well, I can try to name some of them. One of them is that we belong in the white culture, where all the references have been, and that's changing now, but all the references for patriotism and beauty and what have you have been in reference to what white people have accomplished, by and large. And so race hasn't up to this point in our culture, hasn't been an issue for the Caucasian. And it's actually been something to strive for.
Yeah.
To assimilate for those folks who are immigrants who've come into the country. You know, the quicker they can learn to speak English and talk white, the quicker they'll be accepted. And as she reported, one person saying from Dallas, Texas, that the white nationalist is the quickest way to success in his community, aligning with white nationalists. So there you have it. And by the calm, assured look on his face, I would say that Gordon has found his place. So I'm out of here.
Thank you, Jim.
Here.
Yeah, there was a question here that says, oh, now I lost it again. Michael, were you going to say something?
Oh, well, I don't know what I might have been going to say, but Neely left and she's asking for information about the workbook.
The workbook is the workbook for how to be an anti-racist by the author. It's
okay. Well,
let's see if I can get it to show up on the camera. For some reason,
it's not happening.
It's not happening.
That's okay. Neely already.
Anyway, it's called the workbook.
I think what she's wanting is to send her what you were going to read from the workbook.
Oh, okay. All right. I got to find it. I'll find it and send it.
Yeah.
Send it.
I often will have people who will push back when we talk about these kind of things, as far as that, you know, it's always a default of white people, like, and I call it out oftentimes just by reading the news. You can read the newspaper, and especially in like if there's any kind of crime or anything happens, it'll always identify if the person is a Black person.
Yep. Every time,
or a Hispanic person, but it won't say anything if it's a white person. You're just supposed to know that by default, you know, and just little things like that, subtle things like that. And I can only say that if you can't understand that, imagine being a brown person when Band-Aids came out, and for up until probably maybe 6 or 7 years ago, Band-Aids only came in one color as far as flesh tone. And we were told that was flesh tone, but it didn't match me, and it didn't match most of my family. But just that little thing there of knowing that by default, the white race has always been thought of as what is normal, and anything other is not normal.
Yeah. Yep, that is true.
Did you find your place in your workbook?
No, I'm going to have to look for it again. I read a lot of stuff, and sometimes
yeah. I do like your suggestion, Jim. I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe Jim, if you got it, you'll find it before me. One of the things I am going to do as soon as we're done here is I am going to create a Facebook group, a private Facebook group, like I do for other classes I teach, and I'll send invitations to everybody whose information I have. And it would be a private place where you can post stuff during the week and have conversations and questions and all of that. So be looking for that. If I don't have the ability to send you that information, shoot me an email, and I'll make sure I get you connected. My email address is Gordy, that's GORDY 158 @gmail.com. That's Gordy158 @gmail.com. and I'll be happy to get you on there. So any final comments? Questions? All right. Well, I want to thank you all for being here. And Nanda, thank you so much. It's really helpful for me to have you on here. And I know it is for everybody else as well. And it's a conversation we need to continue. So we will continue it next Monday at 2:00. So,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
You all have a great week, and I will see you next week.
It's been really good to be with all of you. I'm learning much.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the day we can all meet in person and actually see each other.
That's right, exactly.
Yep.
Bye. See you next week. Or on
Bye.
Facebook. Bye-bye.